club. You ain't it.
All right, we're live then. Welcome to our second episode of Meeting in the Aisle podcast. I'm your host, Matt Valente, joined here with our other host, Lando, and our second guest, Armand. Hi, how's it going?
Hey, how's it going, Matt?
It's going pretty good. Today's topic, we're going to be talking to Armand about housing. Kind of a general topic here. Pretty much everyone I know has used housing at some point in their lives, whether satisfactorily or not. In this country, sometimes not. Did you have a topic you wanted to start with then?
I think we should just start with, there's a fundamental reality that everyone needs housing.
Yes.
And if you have 5 houses and 6 families, someone's going to be homeless.
That's true.
So what has happened over a long time in the last basically 50 years of the United States is that we have not constructed enough housing. And that has continuously driven up rents, created urban sprawl, has been bad for the environment, and has contributed to our own unhealthiness. So there's a lot of reasons for that. And part of it is that we created a lot of restrictions on actually building housing. So most of the United States is zoned as single-family housing.
Mm-hmm.
You can't put a duplex there. It's got to be a detached yard. And then you go even further. There's things like minimum lot size. And so, now it's got to be on a 5,000 square foot piece of land. And so, you need to be able to afford a 5,000 square foot piece of land in order to buy a house. So that naturally creates very large houses that only very relatively well-off Americans can afford.
Yeah, it's not very dense. You can only have like a certain number of families in a single family house on a 5,000 square foot plot of land. That makes sense.
Meanwhile, in the urban neighborhoods, the wealthiest ones, they're building these rapid luxury condo units.
Oh, yes. Here in Seattle, we get a lot of those. We're very familiar.
But there's something called the missing middle. We're not building the housing that is in between those two extremes that, people can afford. That's what's affordable.
Yeah, because for me, I just recently moved. And so in the process, I was looking at the prices of a lot of these places that had just kind of popped up in some of the neighborhoods. And they were pretty small and really expensive for what they were. It was like over $2,000 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment in a very tall building. It was pretty small.
Right. Rents relative to wages have soared a lot, and rents and housing prices relative to wages have soared a lot. And I think that what I'm interested in is finding new ways to build housing, build better neighborhoods, because I think there's a lot to be said about the missing middle housing. They're, closer together. You have more neighbors. You can bring in mixed commercial uses, have stores. You can create a community around these things. They don't have to be our worst stereotypes of them.
Right. I'm just curious, what would an example of one of these middle housing projects look like?
So from where I live, Boston, the classic is the triple decker. There a lot of housing was constructed for immigrants in the early 1900s, and it's basically a house that has 3 apartments. Each floor belongs to one family.
Like a super duplex.
Yeah, like, and duplexes are, and then they could even just be like really small houses on a smaller parcel of land, maybe 1,000 square feet. They wouldn't have like yards or anything. There's a lot of options, which is the great thing about housing is that, you know, you can build larger apartment buildings, you can build duplex, person that owns the house can convert theirs into a duplex for extra income, or you can build what we call granny flats, and in the technical term, it's an accessory dwelling unit. It's basically a small guest house also on your property.
Oh, Lando has one of those actually. Mm-hmm. He's got one of those, and I think somebody rents that out as their bedroom, something like that.
It's a living room. Yeah,
okay, it's a living room.
It's a small, tiny apartment, but they like make it worth the price by, you know, giving a whole shed. They're like, no one can live in there, no one can stay the night, but you're welcome to, like, you know, use it as an office or a living room or whatever.
Yeah. So there's a lot of other restrictions though. Another one is parking. So often, like, developers will say, well, you need every apartment needs 1.5 parking spots per unit or whatever.
Right.
And so that doesn't help us if a lot of those go unused. And so I'm interested also in creating better transit options. So I work a lot on buses, and like showing that you can use public transit as an option to replace parking. And parking actually does take up a lot of it. Like, for every car in America, there's about 8 parking spaces, which is the size of a regular single-family house.
Yeah, I never really considered that. And there has to be. Like, you can't just have one parking space for each car in America, because then no one would be able to actually park anywhere.
Right. Like, you know, you think about a Walmart, like, there's the Walmart, and then there's the parking lot.
Which is usually as big or bigger than the Walmart itself.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of space.
It's a lot of space. And so, you know, like, if people have other options to get around than just car, then, you know, you don't need these big parking lots anymore. And that makes the place more walkable. You don't feel like you're constantly out in the open with the sun beating on you, and, you know, you have to walk a mile to get from the Walmart to the Target that's next to it.
Yeah.
You know, building a lot of little businesses. So Missing Meadow, like, it brings in a lot of what people think actually of as small towns when they think small town. You know, there's a downtown, but we always think of it as separate from our other sphere, the single family house.
Mm-hmm.
And they both are, those businesses rely on, like, you know, that nearby housing. You know, they need people going there. That's what drives their customer base.
I mean, especially Boston. Like, I lived in Boston for a while, and if you can afford to live and work in Boston, you're probably doing something kind of important for them to be paying you that much. More than likely, you live outside of the city and you drive in.
Yeah. You know, there's also, like, wealthy communities. Like, of course, Dorchester is one of the poorer communities in Massachusetts. It's located in Boston.
That's true. It's like right in the middle of downtown, like South downtown Boston, for people who aren't familiar with that. It's like kind of smack in the middle of the city.
Yeah. There's often, like, neighborhoods that have been neglected by city and city investment. Usually, if you think entirely of the city in terms of your downtown and then the commuters coming into it,
yeah,
you have a different focus than on, like, how you think about the people who support the city, because often they work in the neighborhoods, but they don't get the same public transit investment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they don't really get the same thought of planning or in just, you know, park investments or things that you expect out of the city in general, especially because that's all flowing to the suburbs as more and more people are commuting, and that's where their tax dollars are based.
Yeah. And then we have this, like, kind of phenomena where the downtown sphere, this separate reality from the suburbs, is just, it keeps getting bigger by necessity. Like you were saying, we need to find space for all of these people to live. And so it either has to start leaking out into the suburbs or start getting more dense.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there's, like, a great catch-22 of investing in a neighborhood, is that Well, if you start making it nicer, more people want to live there, which raises the rent, which raises the property values, and that's good for some people, but not good for others. And you get yourself in a catch-22 that you end up like taking away the neighborhood from the people you're trying to help. And what do you do about that? And I think like a big part of the problem is that the suburban voters are strongly incentivized to want to keep their property values up.
Yeah. Nobody wants,
so, you know,
it's considered like an investment, is that you're supposed to buy property and eventually it's going to be worth more. And if it's not, something wrong happened.
We've expected the government to prop up this property values for us.
Yeah.
You know, mostly by not letting other people be housed. So we should also rethink, like at the federal level, like the mortgage interest deduction, which allows people mostly to buy bigger and bigger houses than they otherwise would on the same income. So most of the money ends up going to people who are making, you know, 100K or 200K and that kind of income, rather than people tend to get started on the first time.
And then one of the other things, like you were saying earlier, there's kind of this limited amount of houses that can exist. But then it seems as though a lot of the houses are owned by multiple homes are owned by single people. Like they start collecting them and like renting them out instead of selling them.
Yeah. So, you know, that's a common business. So, like, definitely we always know that there's going to be a need for temporary housing, right? Like, people move around for jobs. And so it makes some sense that we need at least some level of rental. And the trade-off is that, these are people who also are very incentivized to raise the property values, and they vote, while renters kind of don't tend to vote less, or they tend to be people who are not there yet. And so they don't have any control over the policies of wherever they're moving to.
Yeah, property owners have power politically in some form, whereas renters typically don't.
Yeah.
By design.
Especially in knowledge, too, of the local area.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, there's a lot, when you have like millions of dollars invested in a town, it's much more worth your effort to go, you know, talk to your city councilor and make sure they know who you are and what your interests are, than like, you know, a lot of renters who, you know, over a long time, they lose a small amount of money, but a small bit of money up each step.
Yeah, I think the phrase skin in the game comes to mind, where like, they have literal, like the money that they earned through however they got their money, they've put it back into it, and they don't want to see it go away or become worse. It makes sense.
You guys ever heard of Henry George?
Henry George? No, the name doesn't ring a bell to me. So
he was a early 1900s, late 1800s economist and, philosopher.
Okay.
So he actually had a full parade for him at his death in New York City, down Broadway. He was a very famous man. He had run for mayor.
The people liked him, or the parade was because they were happy?
And he's actually like a great progressive icon, I think, that a lot of times has been forgotten.
Okay.
And so he wrote a book called On Progress and Poverty. And so he divides kind of the economy into three groups of people. You have your labor, you have capital, and you have land. And to a degree, everybody can be, you know, one or both or all of those things. You know, a person who runs like a small business, you know, as a blacksmith in his time, or or a grocer is like a laborer and a capitalist. And if he owns the land, he's also a landowner.
Yeah, they're almost like revenue streams that are accessible by anyone. But by accessing that, it kind of like changes the type of person you are, sort of, economically.
Yeah, and so, you know, a capitalist may primarily be concerned with the operation of a factory, but they still own some land. Whereas, you know, the landowner is more who's renting apartments or houses, you know, they're collecting rent on their property. So one thing is that, the value of land, like if you own an empty lot and, the world around it becomes really valuable, that value is created by the community and the activity going around you, not the person who bought it.
Yeah.
So unless you're actually doing something with this land, you're not contributing to anything. So what Henry George had proposed in his time was, a tax on the value of land. Like you would pay a tax not based on basically the value of what it would be if you hadn't built anything on it. And, that would be used to fund all sorts of social programs. And so there's still a school of thought called Georgism that advocates this and would even say that this should be the only tax. And I wouldn't go that far, but I do think that Henry George, was really insightful in that, most economists at his time had just kind of considered land and capital the same thing. And Adam Smith actually said it was the only kind of capital there was. So I think it's a revolutionary insight. And, he really was a hero in his time. Like, he had one of the biggest funeral masses ever in New York City history.
So how exactly is that different than what we do currently with property value taxes?
So
it sounds similar.
Value tax, they're similar. So property value tax based on, if you build a house on it and you make that house nicer and you still pay more taxes.
I see. So it's not based on the actual physical land.
Yeah, it's based on if it was an empty lot.
Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so there's a point there is that the land is not really working. Like owning just the land by itself is not a productive economic activity. Building a house is, and renting it out and you're maintaining it and doing all that work, that is a real economic activity.
Yeah.
But just squatting on it is not.
No, it could be lucrative, but it's not productive.
Yeah. And, because land is this limited thing and primarily one of the main jobs of the state is to manage land, is that we should think of this as a community asset. What land, how do we want to distribute it as a society? What is the best way to distribute it as a society? And I think that, our priority on single family homes has kind of made a bunch of trade-offs that we can't really talk about. But, it's the nature of having cars to go everywhere.
Yeah.
And then, it kind of breaks up your sense of community. You don't see your neighbors, you have different relationships with them. Another favorite author of mine is Jane Jacobs, who describes a great ballet of her Upper East Side neighborhood before it was destroyed by Robert Moses. And everybody, knew each other and there were patterns and, I think people related to each other in a different way.
Yeah, I could see that.
So, I kind of thought maybe we'd be steering into the idea of gentrification. And so the way that gentrification kind of relates, because this is something that Matt mentioned that y'all kind of had a disagreement on, and I was kind of thinking it might be a little bit of a central theme.
Sounds good.
Okay, because I'm not coming from an aggrieved place. I'm happy where I am now. But just for background, what happened to me is something I think that's happening a lot in my neighborhood, is that my house that I was renting for 2 years was just sold out from under us. So basically we had 2 months notice and we were like, oh yeah, you got to move, we got lucky, ended up in the same neighborhood because we love it. But we think that the owner, we know he hasn't sold it yet. He was actually showing it while I was still there, but it may sit empty for quite a while because I think that property values are kind of one, they're in Seattle and specifically here, they're kind of jumping up and down, but mostly it's a buyer's market right now, basically, in that because of COVID and people aren't moving around, you're going to get cheap rent or whatever. And so I think maybe until he finds a buyer with enough money who will meet the right price, he can just leave an empty home, which I think is such a crime. We were able to afford to get out of there and come somewhere else. But someone approached me on the street and was like, hey, let me stay with you. I was just I just happened to be by my old house. And I realized, oh, there's a hammock in the backyard and no one's really staying there. So I tried to take him back there, but the hammock was gone. So I brought him to my house and I ended up buying him a hotel room because, it's not just me who lives here. I can't be hey, a stranger's hanging out, But anyway, I just thought wouldn't it just have been so nice if I could be hey, this actually is a house that you can live in or something,
Yeah.
But anyway, my bigger point was that how gentrification kind of gets into this is I think part of the reason that the rents are going up in the first place in Seattle specifically is that tech jobs, a lot of them are based about 4 miles from where I lived in Capitol Hill, and Amazon and Google and Adobe's got a campus in Fremont. I think just like everybody's here. That and the university, but the university's been here for like 150 years or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So people often lament like, oh, these neighborhoods aren't what they used to be, and make Seattle shitty again and all that stuff. But I think gentrification happens as a result of capital moving in. Sometimes, and in this case, it is. And so I think that if the result is that it leaves an empty home, then it's probably net bad. What do you think?
So I definitely strongly think that excess vacancies are caused by low property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to pay for sitting on empty land, you will stop doing that.
Yeah.
I think the broader point to that is just that, you should definitely disincentivize vacancies, like whether that's through a specific vacancy tax, but that's a little difficult to enforce. So I would just recommend, having higher property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely say I have a complicated relationship with gentrification.
Yeah.
We want to avoid like excessive amounts of disruption to people's lives.
Right.
But I also know that, neighborhoods do change over time. Like we were talking earlier about visiting New York, and, my mom's boyfriend grew up in Queens in an Italian, Jewish neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's a Korean neighborhood.
It probably looks completely different.
Yeah, it's totally. And I think that's one of the great things about America is bringing in lots of people. They find a foothold in a lot of these ethnic neighborhoods that split out over time, and then someone else moves into it. And so that change is also like a great part of our life. Like, it's a problem when it becomes excessively disruptive and leaves people without housing. So I like to focus on that issue. To me, I don't want to get into the question of, well, is this neighborhood good as it was 20 years ago? Is it bad? Like, I can understand things like housing, because being homeless is objectively bad, but I don't want to get into, like, should this be an arts neighborhood? Should this be a tech neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest, I would rather not have that at all.
The thing is, we're hipsters, so no matter what, every neighborhood is bad.
It's true.
Yeah,
especially
used
the
to
good
be.
ones.
Yeah. This neighborhood used to be great.
I also worry about creating segregated neighborhoods.
Yeah, I've noticed America does that a lot. that you'll be like, go to a city. This is the part of town where all of the gay people live. This is the part of town where all of the Asian people.
Can we try something? I'm going to name a race of people, and the two of you have to quickly agree on where it is in Boston that they live. Because I can do it for San Antonio. I'll even tell you if you ask. But so, like, where do all the...
Play along at home if you'd like to.
If you live in Boston or you know about Boston. Like, where are the Asian people? Oh, no, specifically, where are the Korean people? We just talked about Korean folks.
In Boston.
In Boston.
Ironically, I would say, ironically, a lot of them are in Dorchester now. Not historically a Korean neighborhood.
I've seen a lot of Vietnamese stuff in Dorchester, too, around Fields Corner. Korean, though. I feel like I've seen it.
Small population, maybe?
Yeah, I just can't think of where.
Where are all the quote-unquote Hispanics / Mexicans?
So we have a Portuguese community in Boston, especially based in East Boston and Everett.
I mean, that's not necessarily Mexican. But
No, yeah, well, you're also kind of seeing this from the West Coast point of view, Lando. In Boston, it's a lot different communities there than we have in West Coast cities, and there's not really a huge Mexican community in Boston, really. At least not like in one specific location. I mean, because I can name off the top of my head. I'm from San Antonio, Texas. If you couldn't tell by the Spurs logo, but so north white, west side is like poor Mexican people. This is like one of those judgmental maps, but it's pretty accurate. East side is definitely black people. That's where a lot of the black population lives, and obviously it's and the south side is also like a different type of poor Mexican or anybody who can't afford to live in any of the other places.
like I said, everybody's spread out to a degree, and also like Mexicans live everywhere because that's just who lives there. But I don't know. I think most American cities have like a judgmental map or something like that. So you were talking about not wanting to segregate cities. How do we avoid that?
So I think, first of all, we need to make it easier to move, so that can also mean rising wages, as well as, lowering the cost of things by building more houses. So often, property owners come up with a lot of excuses. They want to avoid criminals, quote unquote. I feel like a lot of these are dating basically bad faith. And, if you bring some kind of affordable missing middle house into a good school district, then, people who have less opportunity can move there and, take advantage of those great resources.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's really important, especially in places that have great neighborhoods, is making them allow, the missing middle housing. And so people can move the opportunity so that they're not trapped in the same neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And, hopefully that can bring back investment in there, whether that's through the neighborhood changing, becoming host to a new type of neighborhood, or, bringing wealth to the original inhabitants.
And do you think that's something that would have to be like passed through legislation, or do you think it's something that could hopefully show up organically without that?
So there's two things I believe in. One is that the local governments have not done a great job of zoning on their own, and leaving it up to the states, at least in the most important instances, is important. But I also think that a lot of people are turning into the new urbanism movement. We're really rethinking, was this whole suburb thing a good idea? And I think a lot of people are saying no, and they're saying something else. So a lot of city planners are saying we're going to build more walkable cities. We're looking to, change our zoning laws or get rid of parking regulations, and just making our better places to live. So I think the other great thing is that this is a lot of opportunities for a wide group of political interests to get involved, whether you're you can be a free marketeer and be sympathetic to these things, but you can also be left-wing and want to do things that involve building houses. And I think we need to embrace a lot of different strategies, because this really is a crisis. We have about 4 million missing housing units in the United States as of now, and that's not something you can change overnight. We have to get lots of construction people, which is another problem because we've been terrible on immigration and we don't have enough people who know how to build buildings to actually build these houses. So we need to find more laborers. We need to do all sorts of things. And I think another great thing about lowering property values is that it makes it easier for the government to use eminent domain to build public services. Because building a school is expensive because land is expensive.
Yeah.
Building a homeless shelter is expensive for the same reason there are homeless people, because rent is expensive, which creates all sorts of problems. And I think that's because that we haven't really thought about how we use land, except people really want a single family house. I think a lot of those things are culturally put on Americans, and that's not necessarily what we want. And I think really thinking about our neighborhoods and what we want them to look like, I think we can really come to a better consensus about what's going on, what we should do. And we're coming out of the pandemic. A lot of office buildings are vacant. This is a big time for things to change. This is the opportunity to change. And I think we should really sit down and ask ourselves, what will our neighborhood look like for the next 20 years?
I think a lot of people would say, I have no control over that.
Yeah,
personally.
It kind of comes back to the skin in the game, where things are too expensive for the average American to be involved in that process, unfortunately.
I mean, but I think it is a good question to ask, because if you do ask yourself, no matter how much power you have, if you have a vision, you say, I'm going to push to make it this. Most people have no vision. Most people are just passively going to let it happen. So that's how we go political.
Also something that's taught to a new generation of city planners is to involve people and, not to expect politics to be people coming to you as the person in power. Yeah. But you actually going out there and figuring out what people want.
Right.
Really, for me, the issue there is there's zero incentive for the people who are benefiting off of this system to change it. They're
It's
making
absolutely true.
ass over fist money just building these tiny little spots in these big towers, and people will buy them because they have to. Everyone has to live somewhere. And if you knock down everything else in the neighborhood, and that's the only thing you can afford, and that's the neighborhood you have to live in, you're going to buy it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They kind of have us by the balls, the cojones. They know it too.
In the biblical sense.
Yeah, in the biblical sense.
Yeah. So, are YIMBYs a thing in Seattle?
Is what? NIMBYs?
YIMBYs. The yes in my bed. Yeah. There's definitely the new urban. Well, I mean, the new urbanist movement.
I'm not familiar with that term. What is that?
Yes, in my backyard.
But no, I get what it means, but they're like, they want what in their backyard?
Everything.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like social services, refugees, immigrants.
Okay.
You know.
Yeah, I'm definitely in support of that. You know, you need to do more stuff. You know, that means building more services, more social housing, more private housing on the market, all of that stuff. And so I think that's really where we need to emphasize.
Yeah, you've got to help us, Doc. We've tried nothing, and we're all out of ideas.
Disagree on strategy, and I really think we need to do everything that's been suggested.
Yeah, and then just kind of
national effort.
And if something doesn't work after the fact, then we have that conversation like, okay, we tried everything. These are the things that did work. These things, maybe don't do those anymore.
Yeah. You know, that was one of the great things about FDR when he came to the nation during the Depression. Is, you know, he said, I don't exactly know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to try something.
Yeah.
And, you know, we're going to talk about it, and I'm going to try something else.
Yeah, because right now we're on a moving train, and we're heading towards a housing crisis. We really are. There's a bunch of people.
We've done nothing, and we're all out of ideas.
Yeah, and we can't really stop the train.
Yeah.
This train got no brakes.
Yeah,
but we might be able to.
The population is growing, and I think that's a great thing too.
Mm-hmm. No, me too. I really do think it's a good thing that there's more Americans who love this country and who are trying to build it better. But for a lot of people, the reality is hard. People can't afford to live anywhere. That's fucked up.
Yeah. You know, if you can't afford to move, you can't afford to move to where there's a better job. So you're stuck in, you know, whatever place you're at.
Yeah.
And that takes away opportunity too, whether that's just because there are no jobs nearby, or you have to live farther and farther away from your job and spend more and more time commuting, which is bad for you. It's bad for the environment. You know, it's a waste of your time, frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a question I want to pose to both of you. Is I came from a place where my situation was that I was not upwardly mobile. I was stuck in a certain income bracket because of my lack of qualifications. I'm going to say it for the first time on the podcast. I am uneducated.
We all know.
It's apparent. It's apparent, Lando. No, but yeah, you know, it just like, so basically, yeah, I was stuck making like $9 an hour, you know, working several jobs, not making my really actually relatively cheap rent. And that's why one of the reasons I moved up here. And a lot of people do that. And a lot of people come here when they're actually well off and they want to just be here. And that's how gentrification happens.
Yeah.
Like, what's the more ethical choice? Is it to, you know, stay and fight for things to get better where I am, like, you know, build coalitions and, or to come here, get on my feet and then maybe go back or something like that? Because as it stands, I don't plan to go back, but.
Ultimately, I think, like with all of these choices, like you really have to know yourself.
Yeah, it's like a personal thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but when I think about activism, so like I think like, you know, the first thing is just that there's a crisis level of lack of housing, so we just need to build a lot of it. I think pushing for solutions that can build more housing while being inclusive. So one example might be is that a lot of cities require that when a developer builds new units, you know, X amount be left to below average income.
That's Section 8, right?
No, so Section 8.
This is about like high rises and things. I guess
gives you a voucher, and I don't know the details of Section 8, and I don't want to say something that's wrong. So I'll say, like, basically, in some mechanism, you get a voucher to pay your rent, and I don't know what qualifications there are for that.
Yeah, I used to do security at some Section 8 housing, but I never really learned much about the program.
But you could use Section 8 housing in theory to pay for this kind of housing. And basically, like, you'll say, okay, 20% of the units in this new building for the next 10 years will be reserved for people who already live in the neighborhood and make, under, 75% of median income.
it's pretty rough to do that here in Seattle because the median income is like astronomical because people make so much goddamn money here. The affordable housing, like
nobody really is below the poverty line as long as they're working here.
Okay.
Even if they're working not enough to survive, kind of thing.
Right, and so that may work in many places, specifically where I actually came from, because the median income actually makes fucking sense there, I think. But here, it's like $100,000 or something like that.
Yeah, it doesn't help that we've got more billionaires in Seattle than I think any other city. Is that true?
I don't know if that's true.
That might be true. Go look that up, Jeff.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Get to it, Jeff. If there is a Jeff.
If there is a Jeff. But
this is, of course, the most intractable problem. In order to build more housing, usually you have to destroy some housing that already exists because you're converting a house into something else.
Mm-hmm.
There's not, the biggest problem is, once again, there's not like that much empty land left in the United States because a lot of things are like we have built as far as the car can take us. No matter how fast the car is, there's only so fast you can travel across the metro area and get to a job in a reasonable amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's going to be a lot of discomfort, and I have to admit the people who are, deserve it the least or have the least power over it are probably going to be hurt the most.
Mm-hmm.
The best thing we can do is also make sure everywhere else has to build up too, so that, it's not a sudden crunch on one neighborhood in Seattle or a few neighborhoods in San Francisco. But this is a crisis that's going on all over the country. If you're in Mississippi and making $7 an hour, and the price of housing requires $18 an hour, it's still a pretty big crisis for you too.
Right.
A lot of people are experiencing this, and it's not just the people who are living in certain, cities that are experiencing tech. It's going on all over the nation, often to places that you don't think of as gentrified places experiencing gentrification. And it's a tragedy. It's been the tragedy that we've been building for 50 years.
That's true. Yeah.
But it really kind of comes down to just shit city planning 50 years ago. That
bad city planning is something that, does kill a lot of people. You don't see it, but it does.
Yeah.
When we build those big highways, it causes preterm births. Some babies don't survive that.
Can you elaborate on that? I've never heard about that.
So there was a really recent study done in 2019 about New Jersey toll plazas on the Turnpike, and they compared preterm births near the toll booth before they brought in the Easy Pass, and people were collecting around there, paying their tokens, and generating a lot of exhaust fumes. And after, and it turns out that those exhaust fumes make women deliver babies earlier, so it creates more preterm deliveries. So cars do create a lot of pollution, and not just in terms of global warming, in terms of bad things that are bad for our health.
Yeah, it's that's the air we have to breathe. It is also contributing to CO2 or whatever in the atmosphere, but
it's CO2 emissions.
But all of
and
those
carcinogens,
all that shit that we're burning in the gasoline, you're not supposed to breathe that.
Yeah.
And someone can do a fact check on this, but I guess maybe to break up the fucking mood. But yeah, living near a highway does actually affect people with who can have ED tend to have ED, erectile dysfunction, when they live next to a highway. It's funny that terrible pregnancy statistic kind of reminded me that, oh yeah, there's another component to that.
Unless you're really into cars.
It'll make up the difference. That's what the movie Cars by Disney was actually propaganda for, to build up the fetish.
We're gonna remove that in editing.
I'm gonna make it louder.
But yeah, I guess we should probably segue to a new topic from that one.
I can't imagine why.
What about making housing that people don't have to pay for? Is that an option for America?
Yeah, we could build public housing. I think that there's a lot of reasons that it was kind of a disaster from the 60s. One of the things I will criticize is architecture. It was built by all these high modernists who they were more concerned with the building projecting their ego than the building providing a great place to live. And so they're like these huge swooping concrete buildings, and then they have nothing in between them. They're just these concrete towers and grass and cement, that open spaces, and people don't like that.
Yeah, it's kind of soul crushing.
To break it up.
Like that's not really where anyone wants to live every day.
I don't know if the federal government is ready to not screw it up, but I would suggest that states and cities really think about trying to use those new property taxes to maybe make social housing.
Yeah, I've heard, and I don't know how true this is. I didn't look it up before the podcast, but I've heard that Salt Lake City in Utah has a really, really good public housing, and they have almost a zero homelessness problem because of it. And all of the issues related to homelessness aren't kind of weighing down on Salt Lake City as much, because they were just oh, we got the land for it. Let's just build the houses, and if you're homeless, you get your own apartment until you can get a better one that you can afford. Yeah, it's all about building. And for homeless people and street people in general, you definitely want to build that free kind of housing that gets you services. Yeah. But I also think it's important that to not create more homeless people. Where it causes people to be fuck yeah, free house. And then they just decide to stop participating. I mean, it's usually bare bones housing, isn't it? It usually is. It's usually somewhere you would not choose to live still. But it's better than the street. Right. Yeah, and I would point out that these do create kind of social nuisances and aren't really a help to the person themselves. I think that, if it's saving us money and improving someone's life, we should obviously do it. And that often is a problem with people who are opposing it, is that they don't want the homeless people living near them. The NIMBYs as opposed to the YIMBYs. Yeah, so that can become a problem because everyone says not in my neighborhood, and then that covers the entire city. Yep. Or you just have one neighborhood that can say yes to everything, and then all of a sudden that's the only neighborhood that has the whole homeless population of the city. Yeah, which contributes to poverty, declining land values, and all sorts of things. And so these can become very self-fulfilling predictions. Unless we distribute these things evenly, then they tend to get concentrated in the one place that has the least political power to block them. Yeah, that's exactly how San Diego is. I mentioned earlier I worked security at some Section 8 housing, but that was part of a larger project by Father Joe, a Catholic priest down there, where I think he built 7 buildings in the same neighborhood, and they were all they had all the services included, a clinic and dental and all the things that is hard to access for people who don't have a job or a home, but they were kind of all on the same 3 city blocks. And so those 3 city blocks in San Diego, no one goes there because everyone's kind of afraid of it. And it's not a good part of town, honestly. But if they had spread that out, and then everyone in San Diego who comes there, they all go to that neighborhood if they're homeless and looking for services. Right. So, I mean, that's a great example of that happening.
I think that's one reason people come. I guess people who travel, basically, who are homeless, who maybe go from city to city. A lot of them land in Seattle and stay here for a while because we have such relatively good, services. But
do we?
relative to a lot of the United
It's
States.
not a great place to be in America and homeless.
I was about to say,
Um,
I've been here a while. There's not any homeless shelter I know about anywhere.
I mean, there are like 4 or 5 that I can name. Like Mary's Place. There's the one that's kind of near your work.
There's 2 women's shelters,
Mhm.
and then a bunch of like emergency tent cities when it gets cold.
I guess what I mean by services is not housing. I mean, we are on the subject of housing, but basically everything but, because even the shelters are not a solution. I think Mary's Place is a good shelter, but I think that, and they're now in the Amazon building, weirdly enough, and Amazon kind of sponsors them, as a tax dodge, but yeah, like the rules that they impose on people, the fact that it can be an unsafe place for LGBTQ people, people of color. Like I don't know if it's necessarily racist, but it's definitely a lot of the people that volunteer / work there can be transphobic, is what I've heard, because they do still divide you out in the binary. Like this is the women's part and this is the men's part.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's like, you can't be high or on drugs. You have to get there by a certain time. And if you're like just figuring your life out, you're like, oh, if I panhandle on the north side, I can't get back by 7 to the shelter or
Yeah, I'm
whatever.
gonna miss curfew. The doors are locked.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just like, I'm not gonna fucking do that every night kind of thing. And so they're just like, well, I'll just find a place or whatever. But anyway, I don't think that that's a solution. But I think that people tend to pull here because of the health insurance that we have. Like the state has a state Medicare or Medicaid, I forget. I think it's Medicare.
Medicaid is for poor people. Medicare is the old person program.
You got it. Yeah.
Oh, so I can get both then. Being 30 and poor. Some older person's gonna kick my ass for this.
We're looking at you, Tomas.
But anyway, yeah. So one of the ways that I experienced the question of like whether people wanted to put homeless people in a neighborhood, one of the ways that I encountered it was that Matt and I would canvass in some of the surrounding cities of Seattle, so like Federal Way, Auburn, places that you've definitely heard of, Armand, I'm sure. But
like the edges of the county that aren't like really Seattle. Like commuter suburbs.
Literally, exactly. Yeah. And well-off ones, like upper middle class to higher class. And then also,
like interspersed with that, you'd have like trailer parks and stuff.
Yeah, and like extremely poor.
Yeah.
So the point is that when we talk to these voters and ask them point blank, what is the most important issue to you, they would say, well, we want the homeless problem to go, we don't want, I see these guys shooting up outside the grocery store and I don't want to have to explain that to my kids. And, personally, I was like, they need to be anywhere. You can't criminalize them just being, where they can figure out to be. It's like,
yeah.
And then they just don't want to see them, but, and they also didn't want drug treatment centers there. That was another thing that I think a lot of YIMBYs, new urban type people would really want.
But almost all of them would admit that was like a good idea and something that should exist.
Oh, and but
just not there. There's not that many methadone clinics, like nationally, I don't think. They're pretty rare.
Well, one thing my town, Quincy, does, and it's actually a pioneer in opioid epidemic stuff. Like it was one of the first people to get people Narcan street. Anyways, they have mobile clinics. They drive around in trailers or whatever, and they have some kind of replacement therapy. I don't know if it's specifically methadone. So that's one possible solution if it's driven around. I think the other thing is just trying to convince people that everybody's going to have some of it, and if it's all spread out, it's going to be less of a problem. Like, I think people are much more scared of their neighborhood becoming like a tent city than they are of just seeing a couple or one person who's around. So I think the concentration is what really puts it into people's mind, what makes them afraid.
But then them being afraid increases the constant. It's like the snake that eats itself.
Yeah.
It's not going to change until something about that changes.
I think that it has come down to me is that we think that all these towns are independent and, you know, they make their own laws or whatever. But when you look at it, it looks like they copied everybody else's laws.
Yeah.
And so that independence isn't working. It's like basically they're all coming to the same result of their own incentives. And so I think moving it up to the state level. So like Massachusetts, for example, has required that towns upzone everything within a half mile of transit. So like if you're near a commuter rail station, you have to have it as more dense than a single family home.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and you know, like trying to combine like a carrot and a carrot, you know, more services and trying to make the stick less bad can help a lot. But it's still like people are really afraid of the concentration, and people are naturally like don't want change. Like if you have a certain view, you may like it the way it is. You may not want, you know, a big condo building to go in front of it. But people also need a place to live, and it's very hard to navigate these values that we have all competing desires, and trying to find what's best is hard. You know, we can all think that our thing is the most important, you know. Well, you know, my neighborhood once had to add in some extra homeless stuff, so why should I have to now put in a drug treatment center as well?
Yeah.
Those are all hard questions to navigate, and, you know, it's all the messiness of democracy.
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to more people should probably feel comfortable like giving back to their community, like taking sacrifices to help other people. Like, even if it's not like super ideal for you, it's going to make everything better, even if you kind of have to take a hit there.
I think if we live in denser cities and closer to each other, we'll be more aware of that. Like the suburban house with the privacy fence is to block out the rest of the world. You know, to drive in the car, you know, you're going too fast to see everything between you.
That's true.
You know, you don't see that the entire neighborhood of the interstate highway that's going through a city center has blighted the rest of the neighborhood. You're going too fast to notice.
Yeah, you only interact with the people in your bubble, and that's intentional. Like, you're trying not to interact with the other people unless you have let them in, kind of.
Yeah.
And then that translates to how you want your house to be, and then how you influence your children to want their house. And then it becomes a culture where everyone wants 3.5 kids and a huge house with a yard. But it's just...
Yeah, land has always been something tied into the whole American history. You know,
because there was so much of it here and no one was using it.
Yeah, you know, we felt that way forever, and now we're finally hitting the limit of that. Like, it took 300 years.
And a lot of the reason we're hitting it so soon after 300 years is because of all that shit city planning, is that we could have stretched that out for like another 100 years maybe if we had done it smartly, but the 50s happened and everyone was riding high off of World War II ending and everyone had tons of money, and like it felt like nothing could change for America then. It was short-sighted.
Oh yeah. One thing the empire will get you is nothing.
But I am glad that people like you and me and Lando at least are talking about this and see it as a problem. And more than likely that's emulated in a lot of our fellow Americans who see this as a problem and are talking about ways to fix it. You hope.
I mean, some of the opposition I've seen, ironically, are y'all familiar with the app Nextdoor?
I think I heard about it from you, actually.
For the listeners, I'll describe it as best I can. It's basically an app. It's essentially a message board for people in your neighborhood, and you have to be verified by a pamphlet you get in the mail, and then you put your number in, and you're officially in the neighborhood. And basically, it's mostly used to racially profile people that come through and be like, I saw a scary shadow. And literally it's a lot of that. It's a lot of NIMBY stuff, a lot of pro cop stuff. And I'm talking from experience in San Antonio and Seattle. But there are some sort of alternatives to it that are a little better. There's like neighborhood groups in Seattle. They're kind of based around the Buy Nothing groups.
I like those.
Have you heard about Buy Nothing, Armand?
I have not.
Buy Nothing is as far as I can tell, just like a project or like not quite an organization, but more of an idea.
It's like a bunch of Facebook groups.
It's a bunch of Facebook groups where people swap things based on like the particular part of their neighborhood that they encompass. So it can be like a certain number of miles. I forget how they do it, but it's like by you basically have to tell them these are my cross streets, and they say, okay, this is your group. And people just swap goods, for free. You're not allowed to like sell anything. You're not allowed to like trade anything.
Yeah, it's like oh, my kid turned 5. I don't need any of these baby toys anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Does anyone want baby toys? I want baby toys. Okay, let me leave them out on my porch for you. You can come by and grab them.
Yeah, literally. That's exactly what it is. So, I mean, that's kind of a cool way. That's actually probably the principal way that I've met most of my neighbors that I, rarely talk to, but still enjoy interacting with them through that. But there are other groups around it. But next door, those groups are where I'm seeing a lot of the opposition to tent cities being put in your neighborhood, because there's one not too far from us, kind of.
Well, there's one at my work. There's a tent
That's right.
city in the parking lot of the preschool I work in.
Mm-hmm.
And I gotta say, I've never had any issues from any of the people who have used the services there.
That's good to hear.
It's a really great service. We do it every year.
No, I've done the method on mile in Boston. It's fine.
What is that? I don't know what that is.
So we have basically like a large homeless encampment along Washington Street.
It's like
in
Boston Skid Row.
Hmm.
It was called method on mile because of the drugs that was on it.
I see. Is it city sanctioned or just kind of happened, or?
I think it just kind of happened.
It's like organic.
Right. And everyone just said, okay, that's fine.
I think like homeless people have to go somewhere. I mean, we can't make them not take up space.
We're trying real hard to make that happen in Seattle, though. I don't know if you heard about what we call sweeps around here, but
Oh God.
I know people who have been personally, affected by those. I've heard about cops shooting people during them, or basically just ransack an area that's where tent city is kind of propped up.
Yeah, the way I've seen sweeps executed here is that the police will roll up at like 3 a.m. when everyone's dead asleep, start blaring their sirens, getting everyone out of the tents. And then once they're out, they literally destroy all of the stuff and throw it into trash bags.
Mm-hmm.
And then just tell them to kick rocks.
Right.
Which that's not solving anything.
Right.
That's just mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And these sites are picked for a reason.
Yeah, they're usually like public parks and stuff.
Mm-hmm. As they relate to the tent cities, it seems to me that when you allow the tent cities to exist, you have less problems. It seems like because I still see a lot of, and it's hard for me to, there's a lot of like porch pirates. I mean, they're for their neighborhood relatively a lot. A lot of people who are like mentally ill or on drugs, and I hate to equate the two because they're not quite the same, but the similarity is that they may not be quite lucid enough to not hurt someone.
Right.
They're more unpredictable.
Right. And it's not their fault, but it is. So you have a lot of people who are really afraid of them. And it's hard to tell, a small woman to just fucking deal with the fact that there's like a 7-foot tall guy, not 7-foot tall guy, but, a man who's bigger than you trying to harass you, to just fucking deal with it. Like I can't say that. But the thing is, I think it's like, I'm so fucking sorry that happened to you. Can you please just understand that what you need to do about this is not like vote against the tent city if you get the opportunity to vote for it, or to fearmonger about them, or to call the cops ever.
So I do think this creates a lot of like conflict and fear between the existing residents, because often they both think of it as their property. And this is something that is created by creating a lot of homeless people, which is created by having not enough houses.
Right.
Yeah. And it's just going to get worse
until
until we fix it.
Fundamentally to that is that I don't really think anyone woke up one day and said, "Hey, I'm going to be homeless." That sounds like a great, awesome thing to do.
Right.
There's a reason for that, and it's pretty clear that in the United States we're constantly creating more homeless people.
Yeah.
And that's not just people you see in tent cities. It's people who have to live with a relative in very tight living quarters, or live in their car. Or there's all sorts of other ways that, the tent cities and people who are creating public nuisances are kind of like the tip of the iceberg that we're seeing. But there's a lot more suffering that we don't see. And I think people even think is that either, they're going to be housed somewhere. Tent cities might be contributing to the problem in the sense that it's the worst option.
Yeah.
That if they were housed properly, we would not have this problem.
Yeah, it's hard to be mentally stable, even if you're neurotypical and you're living in a tent every night. But then if you're neurodivergent and you're doing that, you're probably not going to be super successful in maintaining your moods, maintaining your life successfully either, because living in a tent sucks.
I mean, so we're talking about mental stability. And I think one of the ways to get people stable enough to use services if they're there, to maintain jobs, if they can afford the medication that keeps them healthy or okay. Like I can. I'm pretty medicated, if it's not obvious. But my bigger point being that the way to get all this to people as a service is Medicare for all. I think that's going to lift people out of poverty, and it's going to create a safety net for homeless folks who otherwise, a lot of times the difference is a medication or a therapy or
well, there's that, and also the fact that, at least when I was working at the homeless shelter, I would talk to people, and the vast majority of people who were there in the homeless shelter were there because they had gotten sick at some point during the year, and then their medical bills ended up taking all their money, and they couldn't afford to live in their house anymore. And so they were temporarily homeless and seeking services, but they were there because they got sick.
Right.
But Medicare for All would at least hopefully make sure that doesn't happen as much, and kind of stem some of that inflow into the homeless population for regular, anyone can get sick.
Not me. That's what you think when you're 29 and you're 30. You're like, oh my God, I have everything. Armand, do you agree that Medicare for All is sort of I'm
personally embracing a universal healthcare program. I'm less interested in the details of how so.
I'm not necessarily super pro Medicare for All, but I agree with Armand there. Anything that gets people the medical attention they need without bankrupting them, that's a cruel system we've got.
I think Medicare for All.
Sometimes I will admit that the easier way to do things in the United States is to do something like the Ryan White AIDS Act, or I don't know, the Orlando whatever mental health bill.
Yeah, start over from scratch.
That's your name, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
But you're saying don't fix the system that we've got because it's too broken almost.
Of course, the problem is that, in the meantime between actually fixing the system and there's a lot of people who get hurt.
Yeah, I think we
do a little bit to bridge the gap. And, obviously the Ryan White AIDS Act is not everything we needed to do to solve the AIDS pandemic or help gay people. Right. But it was better than nothing, especially given the political climate of the United States at the time. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I don't know if the United States has the stomach right now for a really big revolution in regulation.
No.
Wait,
as much as I'd like to think it would be.
Do you mean by the stomach? Do you mean the popular support? Because Medicare for All is incredibly popular.
Well, So there's like population and there's political will. And popularity does not always translate into political will in like a clean way.
Right.
And then of course, there's always the problem of you can say things a lot of ways and get people to vary their support.
Mm-hmm.
And so how these things are going to be communicated, like I can write a question that makes, Medicare for all seem amazing. I can also write a question that makes it seem like the most horrible thing since we invented kicking puppies.
Right.
That sort of messaging and what gets picked up by the public consciousness is all about that. And I think like it's actually similar to the housing problem in that just enough people may not be happy, but they're secure in their investment and they think they'll be okay and that nothing bad will happen to them.
Mm-hmm.
They're like
enough that they're afraid of change.
Yeah, they're like, it's not broken enough for me to risk breaking it to fix the problem.
But then when they lose their job, inevitably, because that's happening in a lot of industries, especially during COVID. First mention of COVID, by the way. Is this the first mention of COVID?
Yeah, I think on both podcasts.
All right.
Stay tuned for the COVID podcast coming soon.
Oh yeah, program. We are going to do a COVID episode. We don't know when.
Yeah, and I think we're actually getting close to the end of this one.
Yep.
I think it's about time to start wrapping this one up.
That's right. Well, I had a point that I was making about COVID. When people lose their job, they also lose their health care. That's when I think they're going to be more even aware of / interested in, any kind of change to the medical system.
Yeah, a solution that fixes it for them now, because now it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of problems in America, unfortunately, is that the voter base is really short-sighted.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem with democracy.
Yeah, is that people want easy-to-digest, quick solutions to difficult, complicated problems.
That's why I want Medicare for all.
Yeah.
I mean, I just...
interpreting the public will is hard. So I think one person I didn't get to bring up who I like to is a man named Robert Moses,
Mm-hmm.
who...
you mentioned him briefly.
A master planner of New York City. And, it's kind of wherever Robert Moses wanted the highway built, that was where it was going to build. But, he was limited more by political forces like William Randolph Hearst. For example, the Manhattan Street Bridge is way south of 125th Street, where it should be for optimal traffic, because William Randolph Hearst owned a bunch of buildings there. And the way not to get things done in New York City is picking a fight with a guy with 3 newspapers.
Yeah.
So when we build things, we also build them along political lines, not just the economic lines or lines that make sense or what we're even selling people on. Like Robert Moses showed what a modern job he was doing, bringing the car to New York City, and how great he was. And we never really had to think about the costs. Like when Robert Moses bulldozed people's houses, he kept it out of newspapers. When he assigned 5 people to the same apartment to save money on building bridges, he kept that out, and he managed to kind of paper it over. And, the public always believed that he was great. And so that's a complicated thing, too, is that the people who run things can often, they know things that we don't. And, who knows how much a bridge really costs anyways.
Yeah, how much of that ends up just getting
unless you
pocketed.
actually are an expert in construction.
Yeah.
And so, we live in our neighborhood especially now that it's COVID, we live in it every day.
Mm-hmm.
And we never really talk about in the news about what we want our communities to be like. Maybe it focuses on far more national issues.
Or individual. I'd say mostly we focus on the what is it going to mean for me? Not like my community, not my nation even really. What's it going to mean for me?
Yeah. And city planning does affect our every day-to-day life, even if it's not something we really are tuned into.
Yeah. Well, good podcast.
Absolutely.
Unless there's more that we want to talk about.
Well, let's ask Armand, what are some things that people with homeowners well-to-do renters, people like that, what is something they can do to bring about change in their personal neighborhoods?
The first thing I would start with is if you are blocking new stuff from being built, please don't do that. That being said, these are not hard and fast rules. If somebody's planning to build a sewage waste dump in your neighborhood that's going to poison people, that's a legitimate concern. But if it's, other people you'll have to share your neighborhood with other people, that's not a legitimate concern.
Mm-hmm.
I would say definitely pay attention to your local races. We're starting to put in more YIMBY candidates. Definitely, if you are interested in like a new low-income division that's being set up, a lot of times it needs someone to talk for it in the city hall meeting, because there's going to be a line of people who don't want it. And even if there's still less people, it can give your officials the courage to go on with something. And if you see some hostile propaganda, tear it down. If someone's saying about how scary the homeless shelter is on a sign, it can go away.
I'm not going to say I've done that.
Politics is a dirty business.
Yeah. I'll just say those yard signs have a really easy handle in the middle to pull up on. I've heard. Thank you so much, Armand, for being here. It's also very nice to meet you.
Thank you for taking your time, and I really enjoyed talking to y'all.
Yeah, this was super fun. We'll have to try and do this again sometime, maybe years down the road, months down the road, as this podcast hopefully continues.
We'll see.
We'll see. But so far, we're down for cast number 2 with our good friend Armand here. And we hope you learned something, or it gave you something to think about and mull over, or changed your opinion.
It's a big club.
And we'll say goodbye to the internet and to the podcast. And bye, everybody.
Logging off.